whenever you're ready.
Okay. Okay, let me put my timer so I don't keep you more than necessary. Okay, perfect. So thank you all for taking part of your afternoon. We have a little bit snow here in North Carolina, just like half an inch. It will probably be gone in half an hour. Welcome to Queer Archaeology and Archaeological Practice seminar. And the idea behind this seminar is to give you a very broad understanding of what queer archaeology is and what queer archaeology does. This is what I think is the main ideas, the main takeaways we need to have in order to make our research more inclusive, our research more queer, and our practice also more welcoming to every folk and to everyone. So if you have any questions in chat, I can answer your questions in Spanish and in English. Okay, so according to the abstract, and this is the reason why you're here, and probably because you're my friend, queer archaeology is a way to question the approach and biases of the discipline of archaeology. The topic has regained traction 20 years after the publication of the Journal of Queer Archaeology's special issue on queer archaeologists. This 1 hour-long seminar will discuss how to apply the concept of queer theory to archaeological context and how to make archaeological practice more welcoming to folks from all genders and sexualities. And from this abstract, there are some things that I'm going to use to create I used to create the contents of this PowerPoint. Questions, the approach and biases, queer theory, archaeological practice, and gender and sexualities. If I put this in a more pedagogical way, we are going to question the approaches and biases that archaeology has and that our interpretation of the archaeological context and of our materials have in them because we are doing the interpretations. We're going to discuss what queer theory is, a very ballpark approach, like a soft introduction to it. There's a lot of literature about it. What queer theory in the archaeological practice looks like, and gender and sexualities in the archaeological practice and how we are approaching that. But to begin with, we're going to start with some basic terminologies. We need to have the same language, so we are on the same page in a bunch of things. And then I'm going to share with you some of my own thoughts and reflections after so many years of thinking about the applications of queer theory to archaeology, to my research, and the development of my own archaeological activity as a Peruvian queer archaeologist. We have the hyperlinks for when you get the PowerPoint. Hyperlinks, not queer links. That was not on purpose. Okay, so maybe you've seen this image on Facebook, on Instagram, somebody sent it to you, or maybe this is the first time you've seen it. In any case, it's a really nice resource that you can use in classes. It explains the different aspects of a person's gender and sexual identity. Our gender and sexual identities are not the same thing, and usually these are just misunderstood by different people, and they think that being a homosexual is the same thing as being extremely feminine or extremely masculine. That is the different thing that they are expecting from you according to your sex assigned verb. And this is so convoluted. But let me explain to you what this means. And this is something that you already know. Just Bear with me for a minute so we can all be on the same page. Gender identity is how a person feels, identifies, feels in her heart, feels in her brain, in her mind, in their mind about the gender they identify with. Could be a man, could be a woman, or something in between. Gender expression, on the other hand, is how they present to the world in terms of how they look like, how other people, when they see them, they make an assumption. How do you feel? My gender expression could, at some point in my life, be very feminine. I could maybe wear a lot of dresses, and now it's maybe very masculine. That's my gender expression. Anatomical sex, it's whatever physical trait describe our sex. It could be our genitals. It could be our genes, for example. It could be our hormones. So all these different physical and biological traits will determine our anatomical sex. In society, usually having an anatomical sex gives you a gender identity that usually have a set of a gender expression. That's why society expects. But as we know now, and as we see in day-to-day life, that's not a straight line. That's not a direct correspondence. In a different page is what we are attracted to. If we are attracted to somebody of our same gender identity, or if we're attracted to somebody from a different gender identity, or if we're attracted to somebody with just a fluid gender identity, right? So those are how we identify what is our gender expression, what is our gender identity, and what is our sexual orientation, just to have all that. And within that big umbrella of terms, you maybe have here much more often the term queer. And the story of the term queer went from, in English at least, from being being a slur basically, to be reclaimed by the LGBT community at some point, and to then jump to the academic circles. And now it's used as an umbrella term. But at the beginning, as soon as it was reclaimed, it was used to identify gay men and lesbian women and bisexual individuals. But now the term queer and queer community has become something much more inclusive, that has this big meaning that includes people of different genders, people of different expressions, transgender people, people from different ethnicities, asexual people, people with different abilities. And it's these big umbrella terms that includes every sexual and gender minorities who are usually not heterosexual. We all have reclaimed this term. And of course, in academic circles, queer was a way, or it showed up in a way of being transgressive and reclaiming that term that was very offensive at some point. And we start hearing these seminars in universities, seminars on queer studies and whatnot. And now, finally, it arrived to us. It arrived to archaeology, and the path that how queer theory arrived to us, to archaeology. It's very, it came after feminist theory and gender theory, and queer theory basically walk the path that gender theory and feminist theories, and that once that jump into archaeology, queer theory was used. Not that was used, it was embraced a little bit more easily. But it will be a disservice to you if I try to explain the entire complexity of what queer theory is. But in summary, queer theory challenges ideas of fixed and essential identities, for example, that a person, as I was saying, it's born and has a fixed identity and it never changes. It challenges this idea of fixed sex and gender. It challenges this idea of normal versus not normal. What queer theory does, support by feminist theory and gender theories, it defines this idea of binaries. It defines this idea of normalization. It's queer theory forced us to ask us what is different here. How can we approach things and try to understand things from a different perspective? And from that, what we in academic circles try to say is we need to queer knowledge, we need to queer identities, and we need to queer institutions, because it's necessary to revisit some of the things that academics have said all the time, because we know that academia has been built in this framework of Western knowledge and usually patriarchal knowledge, and we need to kind of break with that, and queer theory allows us to do that. One of the main things, and this is taken from Judith Butler, and one of the main things that queer theory does is that it allows us to break with certain patterns of identity. For example, the idea of you have a fixed sex, male or female, upon which culture builds a stable gender, masculine or feminine, which determines just desires towards opposite or same sex. That's a straight line, but that's a little bit more complicated. We kind of need to break out of the matrix and think this in terms of you have a body, you may perform an identity, and you have desires. So with that, again, a very fast approach to and fast description of what queer theory is. So with that, then, what is queer archaeology, and how can we apply this different way of seeing the world to archaeology and to the past? So for that, I make some notes to my previous slide. Then queer archaeology, instead of challenge only fixed and essential identities, challenges fixed and essential identities in the past, because that's what we study, and not only challenge sex and genders, but also binaries and archaeological interpretations. We're going to talk about this in the next slide, but the application of queer theory to archaeology give us the opportunity not only to challenge those binaries in the study of past sexualities, but allow us to challenge those binaries in other types of interpretations. For example, the idea of elite and commoners. And that's something Chelsea Blackmore does in her famous 2011 article. I'm going to talk about that in the next few minutes. Then queer archaeology challenged our own Western Christian colonial patriarchal heteronormative and white supremacist biases, because we need to recognize the history of anthropological research and archaeological research, and how we built knowledge about the other with what we have as baggage, what we have as a point of comparison. And now that we are out of the matrix, we need to recognize what our biases are, and these are our biases, and we need to be aware of those, and we need to break out of those and have this queer approach that takes into account our own baggage. To do that, we not only need to queer knowledge, identities, and institutions, but also our practice, because queer archaeology, as much as some of us would like to see the first evidence of a queer couple in our respective research areas, that is not the goal of queer archaeology. Queer archaeology is this way of understanding, of approaching our research, of interpreting our data, and to practice archaeology, because we also have queer individuals practicing queer archaeology, and we're going to also talk about that in a minute. Have you questioned the approach of your discipline today? And this is a subtitle that I often use, because what queer archaeology is trying to do is breaking out of our biases, breaking out of binaries. And as I mentioned before, the idea of queer archaeology is not necessarily trying to find the oldest queer couple, even though we have this famous case here that was revisited in the famous War Archaeology in 2000 about this mural about this burial in Egypt of these first believed brothers, then believed twins, and now assumed lovers. So it's not only the study of the sexuality in the past and different sexualities in the past that are not only heteronormative, but also to understand that this queer approach to the past will allow us to break with those ideas of static binaries, to replace the narrow reductive gaze with more subtle appreciation of cultural variation. It's not necessarily this revolutionary queer act. It's good science, as Weiss Mantell puts it in her article from 2013. Now, queer archaeology and research, and this is to have something more of bullet points, it criticizes research that doesn't understand how problematic it is to see past societies with lenses of Euro-American, Judeo-Christian, Western binaries approaches to family, social structures, and sex. Not all the societies that not necessarily the societies that we work with and in different areas have the same social structures that our Western society has. Challenges the idea of static identities, brings to the front the concept of gender identities, is an opposition to normative approaches and rethinking binaries, commoners elite, religious secular, private public. We need to also think about the binaries that we constantly construct in our research, and especially in our interpretations. Opens up discussions about sexuality in the past. And I mentioned this article by Chelsea Blackmore from 2011. And she summarizes and has a beautiful example on how we challenge the normalization of the definition of what a commoner is and how we describe that, and how we just keep using the same definitions, and how the creation of a dichotomy, how the creation of a definition usually creates a dichotomy, and that creates, as she says, unspoken hierarchies. In this case, she uses queer theory to study identity and status. It's the constructions of commoner are part of a dichotomous binary, one structure in opposition to the identities and practices of elite. It creates, as I said, unspoken hierarchy. And in this article, How to Queer the Past Without Sex, Queer Theory, Feminism, and Archaeological Identity, it's a very clear example of how a queer approach does not necessarily mean to find about the sexuality of the gender identity of past cultures, but is focusing on how to give a different look to our archaeological record, to our evidence, and to what we are seeing. So with that in mind, we have two approaches to queer theory: to study, for sure, past, the sexuality in the past, but also, on the other hand, to have this queer approach to understanding our data, and also a queer approach to understanding, to ask different type of questions. What emerged out of post-processual feminist, queer, indigenous, Black, and post-colonial discourses was the centrality of who does archaeology and whom that archaeology affects. And this is, I use this quote from Cook in an article about UI archaeology and digital engagements, because in this discussion, it links the discussion of the queer practice to the queer individuals and to the things we're doing in everyday archaeological practice. And we need to be aware of who is doing the archaeology, and with that have in mind who is doing the archaeology, who are our colleagues, and if in all the years that we've been practicing our archaeology, we have had different type of inputs from probably queer folks, and how we have deal with that input. We discussed a little bit the first two, and I want to just take a moment to discuss the last one, embracing queer individuals. And here the subtitle could be throwing you off a little bit, the queer art of failure, and I changed it for the queer art of transforming. And Halberstam has the book called it The Queer Art of Failure. That's actually really good. It's different than the title suggests. The sheer impossibility of succeeding through a normative model can push this unconventional scholar to take greater risk because they already occupy uncharted territory, and therefore, by default, take unconventional do-it-yourself approaches, which in turn blaze a trail for more conventional scholarship to follow. And just want to stay here for a little bit and think that probably in these last 3 to 5 years, things have changed a lot. Things have changed a lot in the last 4 years. But besides that, it's been more acceptable, and we've seen even in SA meetings a more welcoming approach in different aspects. But 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when we have the first publication, the publication of the word, special word archaeologists and queer archaeologists, it was very different. It was very different when I was studying, when I was an undergrad. And recognizing recognizing that queer folks and queer archaeologists bring something different to the table is something that we need to think also with different eyes, because queer individuals have to, or have had to, move in a different way in a normalized world, in a world that is set up not for them, or was not set up for them in any ways. So they need to be more creative in order to navigate it, right? So in this way, their brain, it's used to think in a more creative, in a more queer way. And that approach to archaeology, that approach to research, brought so much to the table. And it's not only that they bring in their queer perspective, because of course, if I see the archaeological context and I see something else than just a normative binary approach to a domestic unit, probably my approach will be different than cis, straight, 60-year-old white archaeologists. Probably, I don't know. But besides that approach that I bring to the table, I really believe that this idea that we see the world with different eyes, we see the world with queer eyes, has led us to really move around in the practice of archaeology in a different way, and not only from how we do archaeology, but also how we replicate that, and what is the space we give to younger archaeologists, to our future students, to the people we work in the field with. And this is important because are we giving and creating enough spaces to allow unconventional scholars to show us queer ways? And this is, here we go to the self-ethnography or something in those lines, because I started my path in archaeology following the usual way. Not only the way I presented to the world, not only my gender expression, that was archaeologist, but I was going to the field, I was doing survey, I was doing excavation, I was doing what it was expected of me. But I was, as a queer person, not necessarily in the closet, but not in a place where I was out all the time. And I was definitely, and I am not probably, definitely out in the field. There's always been certain reticence for me to go to the field. In that sense, as one matures and creates its own spaces, queered its spaces and queered your practice, I just have moved and found my own spaces after, of course, I found also great mentors. And I've moved my way out of the shell and out of the archaeological practice shell too, and was able to break out of the, you need to do traditional archaeological projects that entail survey or excavation. And I just took a queer approach to my dissertation project, and I went into the satellite remote sensing, a little bit of machine learning programming approach. So not only, as I was more comfortable with myself and believing that probably I was also getting some experience dyeing my own hair, even though it was not clear, I'll gain confidence in this is the way I like to do things. This is the way I feel more comfortable doing archaeology. This is the way I am more creative. This is the way I can really bring something different to the table. And here you see this is very hardcore satellite remote sensing approaches. But this is where my best queerness come to light, because I approach my research subject and I approach my research from a very unconventional point of view, at least for archaeological research in the late Andean periods. So have you, or your research project, is your research project creating environments that are comfortable enough for people to develop that potential? And one of the things we need to address here is that queer individuals are experts in creating community. And for that, the Queer Archaeology Interest Group that was created in 2014, I think, with Chelsea Blackmore and Don Rutaki taking the lead some years ago and still working on it, had an amazing impact in how younger generation of queer archaeologists show even to our own meetings. And I think that space is one of the most safest space we have found within our own practice, but also it creates a inclusive space where we can not only like know each other and create this space of community, this community, but also we'd create a space of mentorship where maybe in other spaces, in our own universities and whatnot, you could feel some isolation. And this has happened because since 2000 up to 2020, 2021, it's been 20 years, and things just started to change, or at least real change. You perceive real change where being an out queer person at the SAM meeting was not causing people to look at you differently, just happened. That was, I was saying, 5 years ago, even though we have that publication in 2020. So we've been late to the party in comparison to other places like the American Anthropological Association, for example. So there's still work that needs to be done. Then we fix the queer theory definitions. We adapted to queer archaeology, and then we clean it up a bit, and we have this: queer archaeology challenges fixed and essential identities in the past. Queer archaeology challenges not only sex and gender bias, but also challenges binaries in the archaeological interpretation, any type of binaries. Queer archaeology challenges our own Western Christian, colonial, patriarchal, heteronormative, and white supremacist biases. To queer knowledge, it's to queer identities and institutions and practice. And I want to add some final thoughts that have that need to be discussed for sure, but also the need further community discussion. To queer the past, and I said this because it's absolutely necessary to evaluate the past with eyes that challenge the established norm. Absolutely. We need to evaluate the past. We need to use different eyes because we didn't live in the past. We cannot judge the past with our same biases. We cannot judge the past with our same norms. And we are writing the past, and we're writing the history of different peoples, and peoples that are not our own most of the time. So we need to be open at different ideas and just different way of thinking that are, because especially because the past is often used as a reflection of our present. Then to queer the past and to look for non-normative sex and gender behavior can sometimes be interpreted not only as queer, but as transgressive. And as a queer archaeologist, as a queer person, the idea of having examples in the past of queerness gives me absolutely, gives me so much validation. And in any culture, in any part of the world, gives me validation, gives me moral high ground, because we have been used to be always in the margins of history and in the margins of existence. And having that validation feels great. But we as archaeologists, as an anthropologist, have the responsibility to also interpret this very carefully, because the idea of having individuals or society that practice different types of that have different types of sexual behaviors and gender identities that are not binary and heteronormative might not be necessarily a transgression in the past. So we need to read this and just read it and not necessarily give the past a queer flag that will create that will give that a value of transgression, that will give the past that that way that we give now to queerness, that we are transgressive, that we are subversive, that we are out of the norm. Because in the past or in different cultures, that could be just how people was, and that's just amazing. But so the existence of different of out of the norm for us Western cultures, contemporary Western cultures, to give that attribution of transgressiveness, of out of the norm, or subversive to the past. It's just a very fine line, and sometimes it is true that this type of news are just picked up by news outlets, or this type of research is picked up by news outlets, and then it's out of our control, and that's a different story. But we also need to be very clear with the message that we put out there, and especially now with social media, we can have more, not control, but we can put in very clear terms our research also out there. Was the past then transgressive? We need to be careful when describing other spaces, societies, and times. We're having non-binary sexualities, and gender was maybe not the norm, but also not transgressive, not queer. We need to acknowledge the westernized and academic-centric discussions around queerness. I love to say that the past was as queer as I am, but probably the past was just the past and how things were. We need to acknowledge the westernized and academic-centric discussion around queerness. I have so many books about queer theory, and they are so validating in so many things, in so many senses. But we also need to bring the discussion of queerness to our anthropological practice and to our archaeological practice, and just use our our newfound queer approach to try to answer, to ask the right questions, or to ask different questions and then try to answer them with just these queer lenses. But we need to be careful and try not to push our queer academic theory glasses and try to see everything under this very hard theory and not taking into account that we're dealing with people's histories. We need to acknowledge also the humanity of our queer students, colleagues, collaborators, and mentors. Things have changed for good in the past years, but we are still living in a world where we are the product of many decades where queer colleagues couldn't be out, and where queer colleagues were not taken seriously, and just to be able to have these conversations now is a privilege, and we are resting on the work of so many people that started to do this job, started to do this type of research, started to have these conversations long time ago, and we need to acknowledge that. I hope this at least opens a new space for conversations in your projects, with your colleagues, with your students, and with your mentors. Thank you so much. Now I will open the chat for questions. Gracias.
It can take a few moments for people to type questions into the Q&A, but everyone attending, you can type those in.
Can I also take questions in Spanish? Okay, we have some questions coming in. Give me just 2 seconds so I can read it. Okay, I have a question here from Laura Hitzstout. I am teaching about queer archaeology to my freshmen next week. What do you think is the #1 thing they should know? I think the #1 thing freshmen should know is that queer archaeology is more than just talking about sex in the past, and it's more about how you do archaeology, like breaking those. It's a concept easier to teach when you tell them to just break out with biases, break up with binaries. That's something they can grasp without the whole bias of like having to read Judith Butler. If you just tell them this idea, we can start with that, and then you can go crazy and intersectionality, and then keep that line. But I think that beginning and with the idea of like queer theory and queer archaeology tries to break with binaries, and then using the example of sexuality, it's like the first step, and then you kill two birds with one stone. I hope that answers your question. Then another question is, how do you suggest to go about working with descendant communities in these topics? This is, I guess, a case-by-case case, because you have very different type of descendant communities, and it depends what's your relationship with them, and And I can give you my experience of working. I work in the Andes in Peru, and so I'm thinking that you're talking about the Sandan communities like working in archaeology and having queer archaeologists come into the field, or what type of descendant communities? Could you clarify that? I guess the second question, and I will answer it right away. But in the meantime, assuming it's just like going to the field and talking about queer archaeology, if you go to the queer archaeology .com webpage, for example, there's different testimonies from archaeologists that wrote about going to the field as queer individuals, and I know that's not necessarily descendant communities, but it's a very personal example of how to approach that. We have the clarification. Just a second. Okay, yes. What you said, and with the American Groove, if you're not in those communities themselves. That's a really interesting question that I believe I cannot answer from an experience point of view, because I work in the Andes and I am Peruvian. So I know very little, but if you're working with a descendant community, what I will do, and if you're working especially these queer topics, remember that Native American groups have a very close relationship with, have very present practices of two-spirit individuals. So I will go and just ask, and if they like have what is their stand with that, if they have you identify with the elders of the area you're working with, and just ask them to give you, like, to have a conversation about that. I think the best way of approaching any type of relationship with communities is just to have a conversation. I also have to add here that one of the things that I believe, as someone that might take students to the field, for example, and you have to work with communities in different areas of the world, it's like, I'm all for embracing all our students, but I'm also all about safety. And if you're bringing diverse students to your fieldwork, you need to assess, and I'm Peruvian and I work in the Andes, and sometimes I haven't been out to myself. I'm out to myself. I haven't been out in the field because I didn't feel safe. So if I'm having this platform here, I'm just saying my position that if you're taking students somewhere to the field work and you're not very aware of what the stand about queer individuals is in a certain area, you need to, as research director, as a director of the project, you need to do your work and inform yourself so all your students are safe in all the senses. If people always talk and we are always worried, and now more than ever, about the safety and sexual misconduct, and this is very important. We sometimes forget that these things also happen to queer individuals, and we need to be very aware of it. Just use your question to say that, because I forgot about it. Sorry about that. No tengo preguntas, solo quiero decir muchas gracias por la charla. Gracias Jordi por la validación. Siempre es importante que tengamos estas discusiones, creo yo, y agradezco a Beth que me haya dado este espacio para poder tener esa conversación. Thank you, Beth. I forgot I changed language. Thank you, Beth, for giving me this space for having this conversation. I think it's going forward. It's it's a subject that SAA it's supporting really hard with the Queer Archaeology Interest Group, with its members. And I really believe in the creation of community. I really believe that having these spaces create, it's a multiplier. And we'll hopefully, we can have more debates like this in our own projects, in our own universities, and yeah, especially with our younger students.
May we continue to do so. And I do want to direct your attention to the chat because there are some questions coming in through that other box there.
Oh, let me then. Open the chat. Oh, yeah. Much more questions. ¿Existe una relación entre las propuestas del feminismo y la teoría queer en la arqueología? Uf, sí. La teoría queer está basada no está basada, pero tiene sus inicios en el feminismo. Y la arqueología queer saca y usa un montón y aprovecha el momentum de la arqueología feminista para poner sus ideas en el papel y en la investigación. Definitivamente, cuando la arqueología feminista rompe con esta idea del patriarcado, la arqueología queer agarra esa ola y dice, bueno, entonces rompamos con la idea de la binariedad también, en grandes rasgos. Te puedo dar un poco más de bibliografía, que además creo que está en español al respecto, si quieres. Creo que mi correo estaba en el link general, pero sí, o sea, es un vínculo directo, tanto en queer theory sin arqueología como en arqueología queer. En ambos casos venimos del feminismo, somos producto de, y sobre todo del feminismo Black Feminist Thinkers. Y interseccionalidad, esa es la base del pensamiento. Espero que con eso haya respondido un poco tu pregunta. We have another questions. I'm teaching a grad seminar right now on power in archaeology, and the big question is how to ensure we don't repeat past colonial patriarchal racist mistakes. Any advice to them? How not to repeat past? One of the things I was most excited about this talk was this idea that I'm really embracing this approach to queer everything. But I will think twice when trying to queer everything without thinking what I'm studying, what I'm seeing, who I'm working with. I cannot push my queer agenda. I cannot push this idea, for example, of transgression on an archaeological record when things were not considered transgression before. We have this idea of normalization of heterosexual patriarchal behaviors, especially, for example, in the Andes with the Spanish and whatnot, but before what? In different cultures, in different areas in the Andes, things were different. And we are coming now with these different ideas of queer theory to interpret past iconography, to interpret different, to interpret old archaeological records and new archaeological records. And we are so excited about this. I'm really excited about this. But we need to just stop for a little bit, just for a little bit before we print something. And since like, have I talked to the communities? Have I read what the locals are publishing about this. And I think that's the best way of not committing the same mistakes that we have done before. Because these ideas that I think are like, this is amazing, this is so transgressive, this like the queers were ruling the world in the past, is like, or they were just being. And for that piece of extra information that I think I can get from my 3 volumes of queer theory, I should also talk first with the descendant communities. I should talk first with the local archaeologists that probably have some more information that I don't have. I thought that's answers your question then. I have one more question. I would like to ask a question from the perspective of an archaeologist working with heritage. Considering that it is not only about the archaeological record or the past, but how we make the past in the present. It is true that our terminology is ruled by patriarchal Western pastoral logics, defend, protect, safeguard. My question is, how can we queer heritage? Or how can we see heritage with our queer eyes? This is a great question. And I wouldn't, some say that in Spanish we have a saying that is la ignorancia es atrevida. And I think the translation will be, when you don't know something, you are like more bold in saying things. I will say like, whatever heritage, traditional heritage approach is now, doing probably the opposite thing is doing the queer stuff, in plain and simple. But whatever is not expected, it's how we queer stuff. And if heritage is all about, and this is an example because I don't know anything. It's heritage, it was before, let's not touch anything. Let's put everything under a crystal dome and just praise the greatness of the ancients. What will be the opposite? What will be the queerness? What will be the weird thing to do? May that be the queer thing to do with a heritage approach to our past. I'm just thinking right now, Claudia. So, no sé. Puede ser, convence. Bueno, creo que están ahí todas las preguntas. There are all the questions. Thank you for giving me the space. Thank you, Beth, for facilitating this conversation. If you have any other question, you can find me through my email at gabriela.ore@vanderbilt.edu. Probably if you Google me. I'm not that famous, but it's the link comes from my university. So yeah, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon and stay safe.